So in this section of Unit 9, we are going to discuss Reconstruction plans. Plans put forth to reunite the Union and bring the South back into the Union. These plans also addressed the fate of newly freed African Americans, and there was a lot of struggle between the executive branch and the legislative branch of which was the best way to go. So our essential question is, what problems did the nation face during Reconstruction, and how did plans differ to address them? So first of all, to reconstruct means to put back together, and that is what we are going to be doing as a nation during this period following the Civil War, putting the nation back together politically, but also reconstructing the South, where we know from the war there was incredible damage. Some of the questions to be solved: how will the South re-enter the Union? What branch of government will set the terms for re-entry, the president or Congress? And what rights will newly freed African Americans have? Just like secession, obviously the Constitution didn't lay out a process for reuniting the country. So these are questions that we have to come together and answer. So the South after the war laid in ruins. Many homes were burned and destroyed, businesses were closed, properties completely abandoned, the railroads were destroyed. Half of the farm machinery and livestock that was in the South prior to the war is gone because of the total war tactics. 25% of white men ages 20 to 40, the fighting population, are dead. They were also the backbone of the economy prior to the war, and there are 4 million freed slaves whose fates are yet to be determined. So we see here some of the photographs, the destruction of the South after the war. Let's start with the 13th Amendment. We know that the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in the South during the war, but it was a temporary war measure, not something that was necessarily legally binding after the war. So one of the first priorities after the war was over was making that official. The United States ended slavery with the 13th Amendment that was passed in December of 1865. We know that Lincoln has already been assassinated. He's not here to see the end of the process, but members of Congress are able to push that through. If you read the text of the 13th Amendment, it says that slavery is outlawed except in cases of imprisonment. Some people have argued that the way the 13th Amendment is worded is what has led to mass incarceration in the United States. If you don't know, we are the country that incarcerates the most amount of people of anywhere in the world. And overwhelmingly, that incarceration impacts minorities in the United States. If you're interested in seeing more about this, there's a Netflix documentary called 13th that shows like that history after the 13th Amendment was passed and how it has impacted Black Americans through today. So Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was called the 10% plan. So in order for the South to re-enter, he wanted 10% of those who had voted in 1860 to swear a loyalty oath to the Union and receive a pardon. So in each state, only 10% of the 1860 population had to swear a loyalty oath to re-enter the Union. Obviously, that leaves the door open for 90% of the population to still not consider themselves truly part of the United States. One other key condition, and this was going to be hard for the southern states, in order to re-enter, they had to ratify the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in the United States. So Lincoln's view on African Americans, he wanted slavery abolished, but he was not concerned with achieving social or political equality for that group of Americans. He just wanted to reunite the nation. So in order to bring the South back in without further conflict, he was willing to kind of negotiate with the Southerners' point of view. Obviously, this plan is really lenient, 10% of the Southern population saying that they are loyal to the United States. So his primary goal was just bringing the two sides back together. Members of Lincoln's own party disagreed with his plan. There was a group in Congress called the Radical Republicans. So this was a small group. They were not the majority. However, they were an important influence during Reconstruction. The Radical Republicans were led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. You probably remember him. They called for full citizenship for African Americans, including the right to vote, and harsh punishments for Confederates, especially the leaders of the rebellion. They wanted them to basically pay for what they had done. So the Radical Republicans are definitely not agreeing with Lincoln, and they certainly are not going to agree with Andrew Johnson, who put forth his own plan. The Radical Republicans' plan for bringing the Union back together was the Wade-Davis Bill. They put this before Congress in 1864, before the war was even over, saying that a majority, at least 51% of pre-war voters had to swear loyalty to the Union and also rewrite their constitutions to make guarantees of African American equality. So not just abolishing slavery, but also guarantees for equality. Obviously, the South, it's going to be a lot harder to get them on board with this plan. Lincoln killed the Wade-Davis bill by pocket veto, which means he didn't technically say no. He just left the bill on his desk until it expired. So he didn't put his approval or his denial behind the bill. He just let it expire. He did not pass the Wade-Davis bill. The Freedmen's Bureau was established after the Civil War. This was another thing proposed by Congress, especially the Radical Republicans, but also supported by Lincoln. The goal was to provide for Black and white refugees in the South, providing them with education, healthcare, clothing, food in the hard times after the Civil War. Another key part was reuniting former slave families who may have been sold to different plantations, bringing them back together, and also representing African Americans in court. The Freedmen's Bureau did a lot of good work in the beginning years of Reconstruction, but we can see up here the Freedmen's Bureau was disbanded by 1872, and prior to its disbandment, it was not very effective. Even though it was providing for both Black and white refugees in the South, the way that they advocated for African Americans made it an unpopular institution in the South among the white population. So Johnson's plan for Reconstruction, for the South to re-enter the Union, states have to ratify the 13th Amendment, so they have to abolish slavery. They have to rewrite their state constitutions to specifically abolish slavery. But in order to appease the South, he would offer pardons and land restoration to former Confederates once they swore allegiance to the Union. So very similar to Abraham Lincoln's plan, very lenient. However, his views on African Americans differed. While Lincoln may not have been concerned with guaranteeing equality, Andrew Johnson was completely unsympathetic to African Americans. He does not want equality. He will fight against equality, including the right to vote. And his belief was that government was for the white man and the white man only. So under Johnson's leadership, Southerners began to restore the old ways. State legislatures quickly began passing black codes, which were laws that specifically limited the rights of African Americans. Black codes stated things such as African Americans could not own land, They could only work in certain jobs. They were barred from positions of authority. They also passed things like vagrancy laws, which said that you could be arrested for not having a job, and these laws would only be carried out in the case of African Americans as a way of imprisoning them. Also, they placed curfews on African Americans, limiting their freedom. They had to have travel permits to go to certain places. So basically, this is the precursor to Jim Crow as a way to once again return African Americans to a second-class citizenship. Congress was not having the black codes. They fight back by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This created federal guarantees to civil rights and overrode those state laws. So these were the Civil Rights Act of 1866 specifically attacked the black codes. President Johnson, with his viewpoint on African Americans, vetoed this act. So he killed it in his office. However, because the South has not rejoined, the Republicans have an overwhelming majority in Congress. So they are able to override the president's veto with a 2/3 majority for the first time ever in United States history. So the Civil Rights Act does become law, and at least for right now, there will be federal guarantees to civil rights protecting those rights of African Americans.